the mistress commanded the slave to drown the infant in the river. But what the river gave back years later transformed everything. A newborn's cry echoing from the slave quarters became a death warrant. Joanna barely had moments to hold her son when Mistress Malvina's scream thundered from the big house. The baby carried skin too light, and the command landed like a violent strike. That bastard would never rest beneath her roof. Malvina instructed Joanna to bring the boy to the Pariba River and resolve the matter before sunset. Joanna remained mute, but her eyes quivered with anguish. How could any mother execute her own child? She had mere hours to reach an impossible verdict. Yet what the mistress never anticipated was what would soon unfold. And everything would start with a secret, concealed between roots and the river's flow. The afternoon descended gradually as Joanna returned to the water, no longer bearing her mistress's order on her shoulders, but carrying her own spirit heavier than the stones scattered along the bank. The Pariba ran deep, dragging branches and darkness along its path, and appeared to observe each step she took. At that exact spot where hours before she'd been compelled to decide between her son's existence and her own endurance, Joanna lowered herself and breathed deeply, as though attempting to stitch together whatever fragments of courage remained within her. Zifa approached quietly from behind, gripping an aged wooden basin, one that had once held plenty of cornbread before becoming merely a relic. The timber showed where yet remained solid enough to transport what Joanna's spirit no longer possessed the strength to abandon. Wind swept sideways as Joanna placed the infant in the basin and covered the bottom with broad leaves that infused the wood with living earth's fragrance. The baby, exhausted from excessive weeping, merely breathed now, maintaining that delicate rhythm unique to newborns. Joanna caressed his brow with a gentleness that felt like farewell yet also carried promise. Zifa knelt beside her and whispered that water, when it receives blameless blood, inevitably discovers a path to restore justice. This represented an ancient faith, passed from one mouth to another long before becoming mere words. Joanna gave no response, yet her eyes kindled with faint illumination, as though someone trying to believe destiny hadn't yet been sealed. The current hummed gently as they guided the basin toward the water. At initial contact, the infant opened his eyes as if perceiving the world transform. Joanna clutched the basin with both hands and allowed the current to pull gradually, taking her son without ripping him from her all at once. The motion seemed insignificant, yet agony shattered through her ribcage like broken glass. The basin rocked, spun between mango tree roots, and floated downstream, carried first by gentle movement, then stronger until it dissolved among the golden reflections of evening. When the basin disappeared, Joanna remained motionless, her bosom aching with milk and stillness. Instinct commanded her to chase after it. But reason, forged like iron through slave quarters' existence, reminded her the mistress never pardoned disobedience. Zifa rose gradually and grasped Joanna's hand like someone anchoring another back to the living world. She explained that the river knew stories of mothers who prayed silently and were heard many years afterward. She also declared, God never loses children. He simply conceals them until the proper moment. Her expressions dropped into Joanna's heart like moisture on heated stone. They didn't heal the wound but prevented it from reopening. The journey back to the plantation dragged slowly. The river's murmur continued resonating in Joanna's ears, mingled with her baby's final warmth in her embrace along the pathway. Each tree seemed to observe her. Every leaf rustled as though safeguarding the recently born secret. When she finally glimpsed the farmhouse courtyard, Joanna sensed the overseer's stare from a distance, watching for any mistake to report to the mistress. Yet she walked directly, expression composed, breath measured, like someone carrying something internally that nobody else could access. In the slave quarters, smoke and flower aromas welcomed her like an aged sanctuary. Certain women looked upward, seeking the infant, but Joanna simply moved past quietly, clenching her fists so trembling wouldn't escape. Her breasts throbbed with milk, swollen and weighted. Still she released no protest. She settled in the darkest corner, rested her head against the earthen wall, and shut her eyes. Outside, the Pariba continued flowing, transporting with it the assurance that nothing born from suffering ever vanishes without imprinting something behind. That night, while the plantation rested and the big house luxuriated in the false tranquility of those who imagine they've triumphed, the river ran, carrying a fresh destiny. Nobody there imagined that the basin sliding between roots and trunks contained not merely a child but the thread that would eventually drag truth from obscurity. Joanna, exhausted, attempted to rest, yet the water's sound persistently returned as though summoning her. And in her heart's deepest chamber, where neither mistress nor whip could penetrate, a tiny, almost concealed sensation started breathing alongside her, the hope that the river would someday restore what it swept away on that silent afternoon. Dawn hadn't fully emerged when Mistress Malvina appeared on the big house veranda, trailing her gown like someone carrying a kingdom of certainties. The morning silence felt lighter following what she had commanded the previous day, and the deceptive calm on her expression made obvious she believed she had recovered authority over the plantation. She moved back and forth, repeating for anyone willing to hear that tranquility had finally returned to this household. Yet each word sounded more like menace than comfort. The kitchen workers, still preparing breakfast, exchanged rapid glances whenever Malvina passed. She moved with determined stride yet appeared unsettled, and even trivial matters displeased her. A tablecloth incorrectly arranged, firewood somewhat too damp, a container misplaced. Even the atmosphere seemed wrong surrounding her. Yet nobody dared express openly that peace never visits the dwelling of someone who commands a mother's child taken. That kind of cruelty attaches itself to earth, to atmosphere, to the eyes of those who serve mutely. Joanna, still enduring the burden of a restless night, attempted maintaining her bearing straight while washing slave quarters rags in the stone basin. Chilled water numbed the heat of milk confined within her body but couldn't cleanse the weight of absence. Periodically, her vision wandered to the path leading toward the river, and it seemed as though the entire universe narrowed to that single point on the horizon. Yet whenever the thought threatened to shatter her, she straightened her spine and resumed her labor. She understood, Malvina observed, prepared to interpret any tremor as resistance. The mistress approached deliberately, her boots pressing into damp soil softened by overnight rain. She halted behind Joanna, so near that their shadows merged momentarily. She uttered nothing. She simply stood there, evaluating how the slave scrubbed the cloths, how she breathed, how she maintained her gaze downward. Every minor gesture acquired distorted meaning through the mistress's perception. Suspicion throbbed within her like an exposed wound, and even after tearing the infant from the slave's existence, she still appeared hungry for additional control. In the kitchen, the women murmured, believing nobody could hear. They remarked that the peace the mistress described consisted of fragile air, that evil deeds don't disappear by declaration, and that the big house walls carried excessive memories to pretend innocence. They spoke without raising their eyes, their words blending with pot steam. Yet each phrase contained the wisdom of those who understand ancient suffering transmitted through generations. In that household, everyone understood genuine peace never returns to a place where a mother's blood was dispatched downstream. Meanwhile, Malvina traversed the house as though stepping on ground that yielded beneath her. Though she attempted appearing firm, bitterness seeped from each movement. She examined the chandelier, the flower arrangement, the floor's shine without genuinely perceiving anything. It was as though she attempted occupying every corner simultaneously, afraid some truth might escape through gaps. Her gaze passed over Joanna like a blade evaluating flesh before cutting. Yet the slave provided no justification, only silence. A silence so substantial it disturbed. And regardless how much Malvina attempted convincing herself everything was properly positioned, something in the atmosphere refused to settle. Possibly it was the expression in other slaves' eyes, partly pity, partly foreboding. Possibly it was how the damp earth appeared to reject her footsteps. Or possibly it was simply guilt's weight which starts disguised but expands rapidly when permitted space. That morning the entire plantation breathed strangely. There existed a scent of rain and mysteries as though nature comprehended more than human eyes could perceive. And for some reason Malvina couldn't clarify, whenever she considered the river, a chill traveled her spine. The evil she believed she had buried was far from resting. It still pulsed, concealed in the current, anticipating the proper instant to ascend to the surface. Night dropped heavily over the plantation, delivering with it a silence that appeared to drive everyone inward. Oil lamps flickered in slave quarters corners, casting shadows on earthen walls. Joanna sat in the same corner where she had slept since childhood, embracing her knees as though attempting to hold her body together to prevent collapsing. Trapped milk made her chest ache, Yet deeper pain came from emptiness that accompanied each breath. Zifa approached slowly, as one does when respecting an exposed wound, and sat beside her without uttering anything for a considerable period. Only after some time did she interrupt the quiet, her tone low and steady. Zifa's murmur carried more truth than solace. She stated, "The river doesn't kill a child. What kills is the hand that orders death." And as she spoke, her fingers toyed with her skirt hem, a gesture mixing nervousness with supplication. Joanna kept her eyes on the floor, yet her tears descended effortlessly, tracking slowly down her face and dissolving into darkness. She moved her head, and the sentence escaping her lips cut through air like a blade. She confessed she had heard the baby's cry until the instant water swallowed his voice. The recollection appeared to suffocate her breath as though she relived the scene every time she attempted resting. The other slaves perceived the atmosphere and reduced their voices further. The entire quarter seemed to attend to that forbidden exchange, even without moving. In one corner, seated on a crooked bench, aged Antonio observed everything with weary eyes of someone who had witnessed excessive injustice to believe in coincidences. He approached closer, dragging his feet across dirt floor, and stopped before Joanna with the composure of someone carrying decades of existence on his back. His wrinkled face inclined forward deliberately, and he spoke in a tone appearing to originate from another era. Antonio explained that the river possessed memory, that certain waters won't swallow what doesn't belong to them. He stated that if the boy lived, he wouldn't return in human time but in God's time. This represented an ancient conviction passed from elders like inheritance nobody dares record. Joanna lifted her gaze for the first time that night, searching the old man's features for some indication of certainty. She didn't discover assurance, yet she found faith, and momentarily that proved sufficient to prevent her from shattering completely. Zifa placed a hand on Joanna's back and started sharing stories of other mothers who had lost children to cruel commands, tales circulating through slave quarters for generations. She spoke of a woman who buried her child in woodland only to discover him grown years afterward, raised by compassionate hands. She spoke of another who only learned her daughter had survived because she heard her name sung at a distant Quilombo celebration. None of it constituted promise, yet all of it reminded them that the world occasionally returns what power attempts to steal. Outside, wind brushed against slave quarters' timber beams, producing a sound resembling lamentation. Joanna shut her eyes and inhaled deeply, attempting to restrain the anguish wave rising from her chest. The river scene returned repeatedly, the basin drifting away, water covering crying, her heart shattering silently. Yet now tangled within that memory was Antonio's voice echoing inside her, stating that certain destinies only disclose themselves when time matures. The conversation persisted until oil lamps started fading. Before sleeping, Zifa murmured a brief prayer, asking God to position his eyes on that boy's journey. Joanna didn't pray aloud, yet her lips moved in darkness, shaping a promise that only she and the river heard. When the quarters finally quieted, silence returned. Yet it wasn't identical. It was silence weighted with premonition, as though something had been awakened inside that space. Something that sooner or later would transform all their fates. Dawn still concealed the world's colors when Mistress Malvina awoke with peculiar unease. The kind that prods the mind before the body comprehends why. The bedroom was tranquil. Her husband slept heavily beside her. Yet something in the atmosphere felt displaced. She rose slowly, ignited the oil lamp, and walked through the big house hallway, her footsteps echoing louder than appropriate. As she neared the rear entrance, she noticed a dried mud trail on floorboards, a crooked mark that shouldn't have existed since insufficient rain had fallen that night to create mud near the dwelling. Yet the floor bore traces. Malvina lowered herself to examine it more closely. The mud adhered there was dark and dense. The color of slave quarters, not the lighter shade of the big house courtyard. She recognized these differences like one recognizes a familiar fragrance. Her chest tightened. She followed the trail to the doorframe where she discovered a boot imprint pressed against timber. The oil lamp flickered when she realized that footprint didn't belong to any enslaved person. It was large, a grown man's boot mark, identical to Sebastiano's. Her blood rose instantly, boiling like heated water. Initially, she attempted believing it was error, yet her mind wouldn't cease assembling the puzzle she had been avoiding. She remembered Joanna's baby's skin color, excessively light to be overlooked. She remembered her husband's hesitation when she pressed him about his late-night visits to the quarters. Most significantly, she remembered his expression when he learned the baby had been sent to the river. What she observed wasn't relief. It was something else. Something dangerously approaching fear. Malvina's world started spinning. She stood frozen for several seconds, sensing cold perspiration slide down her spine. The lamp trembled in her hand, and momentarily, all she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding irregularly in her chest. The possibility forming before her was like a serpent slithering from undergrowth, gradual, low, and impossible to disregard. Because if that baby was excessively light-skinned, and if mud originated from slave quarters, and if Sebastiano had disappeared on certain nights, then what she had always dreaded was materializing. Joanna's child could very well be his child. The thought settled, crushing any attempt at reason. Malvina clutched the boot, examining each inch, and every mark on it appeared to mock her. A woman accustomed to control, to issuing commands and being obeyed, now confronted the reality that she might have shared her own dwelling with silent betrayal. And not merely any betrayal, one mingling blood, enslavement, and disgrace. When she returned to the bedroom, Sebastiano still slept. His face, tranquil in darkness, stirred within her a dangerous combination of hatred and humiliation. She sat on the bed's edge and observed him as though staring at a stranger. She uttered nothing. She didn't touch him, yet inside her, something fractured with a sharp crack. From that instant onward, pain transformed into poison. By sunrise, Malvina was altered, more rigid, colder, more prepared to crush any threat crossing her path. She walked across the veranda with chin elevated, yet her eyes betrayed a fire absent the previous day. She observed Joanna from distance, carrying water buckets, and something stirred within her. It wasn't pure fury. It was worse, the conviction that the slave must be destroyed, not merely from hatred but to eliminate living evidence of her shame. The plantation would experience this transformation before morning concluded. Atmosphere turned tense, as though trees withdrew their branches when she passed. House servants spoke more softly. Enslaved people avoided her path, and even dogs curled beneath porch. From distance, Zifa observed everything with sharp vision, sensing that evil hadn't concluded. It had merely acquired a new designation. And as Malvina traversed the house like someone preparing punishment, the memory of slave quarters mud remained attached to the boot sole she had gripped just hours before. It didn't matter how much she attempted denying it. Now she knew. And truth born from such knowledge resembles a storm advancing gradually. First arrives silence, then arrives thunder, and finally destruction. The day dawned pale with that brightness which doesn't warm, only reveals. From early on, it was evident something was different in the yard. The overseer walked more tense than typical. Enslaved people kept their eyes lower than normal, and even birds appeared to avoid landing near the big house. Joanna sensed the weight before hearing any word. It was as though ground itself warned her that degradation was approaching. Malvina appeared on the veranda wearing a dark dress, her hair pulled excessively tight, and an expression mixing exhaustion with venom. She called Joanna by name without shouting, yet the voice came sharp, cutting through quarters like a whip in atmosphere. When Joanna approached, her hands still damp from water and soap, the other enslaved people positioned themselves around the yard, feigning work yet giving full attention to that path. Nobody required explanation. When the mistress summoned someone with that composure, it was rarely for anything beneficial. Without ceremony before everyone, the mistress commanded Joanna tied to whipping post for an entire afternoon. The overseer didn't inquire why. He simply obeyed. He dragged Joanna to the post with identical coldness one uses to pull a grain sack, bound her wrists with heavy ropes, and the knot-tightening sound echoed louder than any expression. The post, aged acquaintance of so many bodies, appeared to recognize a different pain in her. Not merely enslavement's weight, but a mother's weight torn from her child. And now torn from herself. Malvina descended steps slowly, feeling the entire plantation's attention gather around her. She approached Joanna close enough to smell sweat and suffering mingled. She stared at the slave's face, which still insisted on remaining lifted, and that appeared to anger her more than any insolent reply could. Then she turned to the others and loudly enough for nobody to pretend they hadn't heard, declared, if God wanted her to cry, let him hear it. The phrase fell into the yard like a stone into deep well, raising heavy silence that hurts more than noise. The sun started climbing, merciless. The post's shadow diminished, and heat pressed against Joanna's body as though it too wished to punish her. Her chest ached, not merely from ropes biting into skin, but from trapped milk, child's absence, the knot lodged in her throat that refused becoming scream. She wanted to howl, to excavate earth with feet, to demand from sky where justice concealed itself. Yet her voice was stuck somewhere between heart and mouth. Only her eyes spoke, shining as though holding back an entire storm. Zifa, watching from distance, couldn't endure it. She took 2 steps forward, then 2 more, until she stood close enough for her daring to be noticed. She called Malvina's name with thin thread of respect, attempting reminding the mistress that limits existed, if not before men, then before God. She attempted saying it was sufficient, that Joanna's pain had already been excessive. Yet before her plea could form, the overseer lunged. Zifa attempted intervening and was tripped brutally, yet even on ground she whispered, "Hold on, Joanna. Your child breathes somewhere." That sentence spoken from dirt entered Joanna like a final plank beneath drowning woman. Her body trembled, lips cracked, throat burned, yet that small promise clung to whatever strength remained. Time dragged. Hours passed, each minute weighing as though carrying an entire lifetime. The other enslaved people, pretending continuing chores, watched from eye corners, each storing their anger and helplessness. Aged Antonio, beneath a tree, followed every movement, hands folded over knee as though mourning collective sorrow. As afternoon wore on, Joanna's face lost color and her breath shortened. Some thought she would faint, yet she refused losing consciousness. She stayed aware, as though determined that each second of punishment be witnessed by a deity she still in some hidden place believed observed her. When they finally commanded her release, her body barely responded. Her legs buckled, arms hung heavy, and momentarily it appeared she would collapse right there before everyone. Zifa rushed to her, limping from fall, and held her up. Joanna didn't speak. No groan escaped her mouth, not a word. Only her tear-filled eyes carrying pain too immense for sound. That day, the mistress attempted taking Joanna's voice with whipping post. Yet what she didn't comprehend was that certain pains when they cannot become screams become roots, and roots sooner or later always discover means to break through earth. The day fisherman Manuel discovered the wooden basin started like any other, with Paraíba River flowing calmly and morning mist concealing part of stones. Manuel was a man well acquainted with river silence, one of those who can distinguish water's sound when it carries branch, fish, or memory. Yet that morning, the river felt restless. There was a different sound brushing against banks, a murmur pulling his attention to a spot half concealed among old fig tree roots. He approached cautiously, parting branches with her tip, and then observed the piece of wood caught between rocks. The basin swayed gently as though it had struggled all night not to capsize. Manuel stepped into water up to knees, grasped the wood and felt light weight of something alive inside. When he moved leaves aside, small body of a baby appeared, fragile as first breath. His eyes were half shut, skin cold, yet a faint hope thread escaped his chest with each shallow breath. Manuel froze. He had never observed the river return someone like that, whole and alive, as though it had refused carrying that destiny. The fisherman looked at sky then at current, attempting deciding whether this was blessing or warning. Without thinking twice, he took the child into arms and walked home with wide strides. The baby barely cried. He released only small sounds like he still conversed with river. Manuel stepped through clay-smeared doorway, calling for Rita, his widowed sister who had lived with him since losing husband. Rita possessed steady hands and devoted heart. When she observed the baby wrapped in brother's arms, her eyes widened like windows open to impossible truth. She didn't inquire origin. Certain questions only obstruct miracles. She simply wrapped him in clean cloth, warmed water, and spent hours holding him against chest as though attempting convincing life to remain. The following days were filled with vigil. The boy fought to breathe yet didn't surrender. His tiny hands opened and closed, as though attempting grasping a world he had yet to know. Rita, who had buried a son once before, perceived in that boy a calling she couldn't explain. She cared for him with quiet devotion, offering milk, murmured prayers, and bedtime stories told at hammock edge. Manuel, each time he returned from river, stood silently in doorway observing child sleep. Gradually, that baby started filling the house with warmth it hadn't known in years. Time passed, and the boy grew with strength only those pulled back from death seemed to carry. He was named Bento because Rita declared he had been delivered by God's will. And the boy grew up asking the river what he couldn't remember. His origin, his roots, the blood running through veins. Every time Manuel took him fishing, Bento stared into water as though waiting for current to respond. The fisherman laughed, yet deeply he understood. There was something in boy's gaze that appeared to recognize every riverbank bend, as though his soul had been born there long before body. Over years, Rita told him stories of how he had been found. Stories she stitched together with faith and imagination. She stated the river protects what it doesn't wish, surrendering to death, that certain children arrive in worlds surrounded by greater force. Bento listened closely, storing every detail like someone assembling ancient puzzle, and he always inquired the same question that would follow him entire life: who placed me in river? Rita responded that some desperate love had positioned him there so destiny could save him. And that answer, though incomplete, comforted him temporarily. Bento grew different from other boys, not merely in how he carried himself or eyes depth, but in quiet maturity only those who began life fighting can truly know. Manuel observed all this silently, sensing that river had given him more than God's son. It had given him someone who would someday transform many things, even if nobody yet knew what. The boy already displayed strength in arms, resolve in eyes, and strange sensitivity to water sound. Meanwhile, far away on Sebastiano's plantation, nobody imagined that destiny they had attempted drowning now grew strong, walking, learning, breathing. It was as though river had preserved what it refused losing. The Paraíba knows river always knows when something must not be taken. And that year, while Bento grew among fishing nets, fireside stories, and Rita's loving arms, the current waited patiently for appropriate moment to return to life what had once been entrusted to its care. The first sign came gradually, almost concealed among yellowing coffee leaves. The crops started losing luster, as though earth had grown tired of obeying. The beans withered before harvest. Leaves dropped without reason, and strange dampness smell clung to atmosphere even on dry days. Initially, Sebastiano thought it was merely rough patch, kind every farmer faces. Yet the more he attempted controlling land, the more it seemed slipping from him. The cattle, once his pride, woke restless. Some animals lost weight for no reason. Others limped despite no injury sign. Experienced riders returned from pasture stating forest was excessively quiet, that even birds appeared to avoid singing near pens. It was as though ancient unease had risen from soil to demand what was owed. And with each new day, signs grew clearer. Something deep was unraveling there. Field slaves were first to comprehend what Big House refused admitting. They murmured while weeding or pushing ox carts that earth could feel what mistress had done. They stated no soil, blessed his hand, stained with mother's weeping. Every loose stone, every wilted sprout, every rotted root appeared confirming what everyone feared yet nobody dared speak aloud before masters. There was shadow over plantation, and it didn't come from sky. Sebastiano attempted maintaining appearances. He summoned makeshift agronomists, folk healers, men who claimed understanding land's moods. Yet nothing helped. Drought arrived when they needed rain. Rain arrived when seeds needed rest. Bills accumulated. Free laborers from regions started refusing plantation work, stating something hung heavy in atmosphere. With each new loss, Sebastiano breathed deeper like someone attempting swallowing own guilt before it surfaced on face. Joanna, watching everything from corners where she concealed from humiliation, observed decay advance with same force as Malvina's quiet despair grew. It was as though plantation itself returned the pain mistress had unleashed into world. Punishments became more frequent, Malvina's gaze sharper, yet none gave back control she craved. She blamed others, lazy slaves, unstable weather, weeds, even jealous neighbors. Yet at times she would pause, staring out window as though fearing truth might cross fields and knock on her door. Aged Antonio whispered to Joanna one overcast afternoon that every injustice spilled eventually returns to its source. He said it while staring at wrinkled hands, as though remembering old tales of plantations that collapsed under poorly buried secrets. Joanna said nothing, yet heart recognized truth in those words, like something she had carried since River Day. With each dying sprout, each fallen animal, she felt fate shifting. That current that had taken her child was starting sending echoes back. Sebastiano attempted maintaining role as housemaster. He walked stiffer, gave louder orders, yet eyes revealed something nobody dared mention: fear. A quiet fear tucked into corners, like someone who knows life will collect even what he attempts forgetting. And regardless how much he attempted ignoring it, every time he crossed paths with Joanna in yard, he looked away, not from disdain but because he couldn't face own guilt reflection. The plantation, once stage for parties, business, and family pride, now felt like sick body. Shutters creaked without wind. Once abundant well showed fatigue signs. Nights were marked by whispers, omens, and hushed punishment talk, and all unfolded while far away the boy river had protected grew strong, as though destiny quietly built the moment when past would return to settle ancient debt. The plantation's downfall wasn't merely financial. It was moral. It was spiritual in most human and cultural sense. It was shadow of what had been done to Joanna taking form. And everyone, even those pretending not to see, knew. When earth begins collecting debt, no big house power can silence fate's voice. The day was heavy with heat when a young man appeared, walking along dusty road leading to Sebastiano's plantation. Dust rose at feet, yet he walked with steady calm of someone who knew each step's weight. He carried little, hat worn down by travel, small bag slung over shoulder, and eyes so deep they seemed seeing farther than most. His hands revealed they knew hard work, his posture that he feared no man. When he reached gate, he paused momentarily, breathed deeply, and studied vast land before him, like someone assessing future without knowing he already belonged to it. Bento wasn't man of many words. He had been raised by Rita and Manuel, learning early that river holds secrets yet also responds with power when called upon. And that year, now a grown man, he felt unfamiliar pull in chest, quiet urge to seek work far from home, something like silent tug from place he couldn't name. He walked through villages, slept in barns, and crossed trails where only wind could be heard. Yet when he observed that large plantation marked by earth's wear, he felt certain. This was where he needed to be. He couldn't explain it. He simply followed feeling. Slave quarters were first to notice strangers' arrival. Women paused work. Men lifted heads. And even children drew near with curiosity. There was something about young men that drew attention, strength and serenity blend, something echoing old stories whispered by elders. Yet the one who felt ground shift beneath feet was Joanna. She was washing linens near corral when she heard footsteps not matching usual rhythm. She looked up and observed young men standing before overseer, asking work with simplicity and respect. And in that moment, world around her seemed slowing. She watched him for long seconds. It wasn't his face making her tremble, nor calm voice, but way he held hat between fingers. That gesture, that exact way of lowering head and pressing brim to chest. That gesture, it was Sebastiano's. Same gesture she had seen hundreds of times when Master crossed yard. Resemblance struck Joanna like silent lightning bolt, slicing through skin, heart, and memory. Her entire body knew before mind did. A whisper slipped from lips so low only wind could hear, "My God, it's his father's gesture." Meanwhile, on Big House veranda, Malvina watched with immediate suspicion. There was something about young men unsettling her, as though presence stirred dust she had long attempted hiding beneath morality rugs. There was firmness in eyes feeling like defiance, even though he stood silently. Malvina didn't know who he was or origin, yet she felt gut pang. That old sensation always warning her when some truth threatened surfacing. She muttered to herself without realizing, "There's something about this boy that offends me." Sebastiano also noticed newcomer. He approached closer, inspecting him same way always with new workers. Yet when he looked boy in eye, he faltered briefly. It was as though staring into self-shadow, a memory refusing death. He masked unease, gave quick instructions, and approved hiring. Yet when turning back, face went pale, carrying same restlessness haunting wife. The yard, long used to sensing change, seemed holding breath. Zifa moved closer to Joanna, noticing something had shaken her. She asked softly what was wrong, yet Joanna only replied that sometimes fate walks right up to door without asking permission. Zifa didn't understand yet respected silence. The young man simply gathered things, followed overseer, and started learning plantation work, unaware that each step stirred ancient roots buried deep in that land. As sun started setting, Bento crossed yard again, hidden in shadows. Joanna watched him like someone attempting deciphering memory never lived. The young man seemed unaware of storm brought with him. Yet he carried strength even River would recognize. And there in late afternoon light, Plantation understood without understanding that young man's arrival was no mere coincidence. It was as though Paraíba had returned more than life. It had returned truth, ready to rise. The afternoon was warm when Bento offered helping gather calves wandering from corral. Light breeze stirred fine dust, and hoof sounds on dry earth created rhythm like old conversation between land and creatures. As he guided young animals back into enclosure, he didn't notice Joanna watching from distance, heart clenched with fear and recognition mix. She couldn't take eyes off young men who had arrived like shadow of poorly buried past. When task completed, Bento walked to corral edge to wash hands in watering trough. There, among grass scent and old wood, Joanna gathered courage. She approached slowly as though stepping across still open memories and called to him in low voice. Bento turned calmly, wiping hands on simple linen pants. Late afternoon light struck face, revealing features time had sculpted with strength. He looked at her respectfully, unaware of who she was beyond quiet figure always watching with tearful eyes. Joanna breathed deeply before asking name, though she already knew answer destiny had sewn together. He replied without hesitation, without hiding story carried since childhood, "They call me Bento. They say I came from River." His voice held strength of someone never ashamed of origins, even if unknown. And hearing that sentence, Joanna felt world tremble from within. Knees nearly gave way, yet she stood firm. Words leaving lips weren't planned. They came from soul like prayer released without permission. The river only returns those who have a mission. Bento furrowed brow slightly. He had heard phrases about destiny, blessings, river mysteries before, yet this time felt different. This wasn't fireside wisdom or bedtime comfort stories. Joanna's words carried truth he couldn't quite name, yet they stirred something deep inside. It was as though invisible thread connected them, one starting many years before on morning Manuel found him. Bento placed hand on chest without realizing, attempting calming strange ache suddenly surfacing. Joanna watched him with awe and sorrow mixture. She wanted asking everything, who raised him, if he remembered any scent, if he dreamed of water, yet she couldn't reveal truth just yet. Revelation weight could unravel whatever little balance remained on Plantation, so she stood there holding gaze, like someone attempting soothing longing for something never allowed embracing. Her eyes held pride and regret. His held curiosity and restlessness growing fast like roots spreading in fertile soil. Oxen lowed in distance. Sky started darkening and silence between them carried whole lifetimes. Bento felt urge asking why she looked that way. Why her words touched parts of him he hadn't even known existed. Yet before he could speak, Joanna turned eyes toward distant river, a silver band on horizon. It was almost like asking strength not to fall apart right then. At that moment, aged Antonio passed nearby, leaning on twisted branch cane. He looked at Bento with seasoned eyes, then turned to Joanna and seemed understanding more than said. He said nothing, just nodded slowly, as though recognizing that God's time was starting moving over Plantation. Bento, still unsure of unease inside, tipped hat respectfully and walked back toward lodging. Yet every step felt tugged by something left behind, something he couldn't name yet carrying destiny weight. Joanna remained there at corral edge, chest aching yet also warmed by certainty that River was finally starting return what it had kept safe for so many years. That afternoon, without anyone in Big House noticing, mother and son recognized one another, not through visible blood, but through silent calling only torn-apart bonds understand. And there, under reddening sky, truth started rising. A truth that would transform plantation forever. Morning started heavy with low clouds covering sky as though announcing judgment. In yard, enslaved people moved quickly, attempting avoiding crossing paths with Sinha Malvina, who paced through big house with attention too sharp to hide. She wore on lips that dry irritation always preceding cruelty. Ever since Bento had arrived, plantation seemed breathing differently, and Malvina felt it like splinter in flesh. Bento was working near corn storage when she appeared, firm and ready for fight. She watched him for moments, examining each gesture, each facial feature. There was something in him unsettling her more each passing day, something reminding her far too much of what she had attempted burying in silence. Then, without warning, she called to him before other enslaved people gathered moving corn. Her voice was cold, calculated, laced with venom brooded over years. She humiliated Bento before everyone, calling him son of no one, stating people appearing from nowhere always bring misfortune. A murmur rippled through group, yet nobody dared lift gaze. Bento stood still for moments, as though reaching inside for calm river had given him in earliest days. Then he drew deep breath, lifted head, and replied with quiet firmness cutting through entire yard, "If I'm no one's son, then why do you tremble when I look at you?" His words landed like precise blow. Following silence was so deep, even birds seemed stopping. Malvina was struck as though words had cracked her soul. Face turned pale, and momentarily she couldn't move lips. It was as though sentence had torn away mask worn for years. And at that very moment, Sebastiano, drawn by commotion, appeared at corn-shed door. He had heard enough. The boy's eyes met his, and resemblance between them was undeniable. Time froze. His blood stood before him, alive, returned by current he had once attempted forgetting. Shock made Sebastiano lose breath for a second. He stepped into yard, moving toward Bento with slow, heavy steps. He looked at young men as though seeing past materialized in flesh. It was impossible denying jaw shape, steady stance, even brow furrow way. Everything revealed what he had out of cowardice or convenience pretended never seeing. Truth rose from earth like root breaking through dry ground. Slave quarters gathered, sensing something irreversible unfolding. Yet Joanna arrived first. She walked with purpose despite trembling knees. Heart pounded too loudly in chest. And when she stood before three of them, Malvina pale, Sebastiano shaken, Bento confused, something inside finally found voice. It was as though every silence here had been building toward this exact moment. Her breathing was deep, eyes shining with child memory torn from her. Entire plantation seemed leaning forward, waiting hearing what she would say. Soft wind crossed yard, bringing distant running water scent, as though river itself was present, and before anyone could stop her, she released truth carried buried in chest since current day. This is the son the mistress ordered killed and whom God kept safe. Words echoed in atmosphere, tearing through lies years. Sebastiano staggered back as though earth had shifted beneath. He clutched chest too shaken speaking. Malvina released cry, rage, and despair mixture. Yet nobody feared screams anymore. Her power crumbled before everyone's eyes like clay under hard rain. And there, in that moment, fate did what always does. It placed each soul before its truth. Bento stood speechless for seconds. Then he slowly walked over to Joanna. There was no doubt in eyes, only something ancient, deep, and unexplainable recognizing in her the origin River had been attempting telling him about entire life. When he embraced her, it felt as though waiting whole life for that moment. And words rising from mouth came from place he hadn't known existed, so it was your scent the river wouldn't let me forget. Entire plantation bore witness. Truth didn't ask permission. It simply arrived like tide rising, like water breaking stone, like destiny when it decides time has come. There by corn shed under heavy sky, river returned what belonged to mother. And at last story started being made right. The yard remained still, as though time itself had lost courage moving forward after revelation. Joanna, still wrapped in son's arms, felt chest tremble, not merely from reunion but from invisible force seeming pulsing through atmosphere. It was as though everything buried, tears, prayers, fears, now sprouted there before everyone, illuminated by truth finally risen after so many silent years. When Joanna stepped back slightly from Bento, eyes met Sebastiano's, and this time no more fear existed. The master sat on ground, hands resting on knees, unable maintaining posture power had always demanded. Face looked older, chest rose and fell searching air, and eyes carried shame and awe mixture. Truth had brought him down without shout, without force, just by existing. For men accustomed being obeyed, facing own blood returned by river was too heavy bearing. Beside him, Malvina twisted between rage and humiliation. She attempted rising, yet body failed her. She shouted for respect, shouted for order, yet nobody moved. Entire plantation still stood around her, yet nobody believed in authority anymore. The woman who had dictated others' fate for so many years now observed own fate slipping through fingers. Voice, once so feared, vanished into atmosphere like weak wind before storm. And for first time, she understood what Paraiba does. What falls into waters doesn't disappear. It returns, transformed into judgment. Bento remained at mother's side, holding gently as though attempting compensating all lost time. I scanned slave quarters, corral, distant river, everything simultaneously, as though body understood this land held story pieces he had never known how naming. Suddenly he turned to Joanna, touched shoulder softly, and said with tenderness rising from soul, "So it was your scent the river wouldn't let me forget." It was as though he recognized her as everything origin, even without remembering first world breath. Power of that moment moved Sebastiano. He attempted saying something, yet voice emerged faint, almost extinguished. He looked at Bento with pain mixing regret with late acceptance. In that boy, he observed not merely son never having courage protecting, but living consequence of cowardice. He swallowed shame, battled pride, and finally let shoulders drop, gesture of man who, even if too late, surrenders to own failure weight. Decision arrived without ceremony, like all things rooted in true justice. The master handed over land peace to Bento and Joanna far from plantation. There was no speech, no explanation, only firm look heavy with weariness confirming this restitution was least that could be done. It wasn't gesture erasing past, but offering future no longer marked by slave quarters shadow. Joanna received news with tearful eyes, feeling that carried pain years was finally starting rest. Over following weeks, change spread through region. Some stated never observing plantation so silent after Joanna and Bento left. Others whispered Malvina now walked with tense face, as though hearing things nobody else could. And it was true. From day forward, whenever she neared river, water made strange sound, as though murmuring name in whisper only she could understand. It wasn't threat, it was memory. River returns what belongs to life, yet keeps what belongs to guilt. They state years later, Joanna and Bento became known for keeping land peace where respect and dignity were law. People came from distance and claimed there was something blessed about place. Possibly it was peace finally earned. Possibly it was memory of what had survived death. Or possibly it was simply this, where truth exists, earth blooms. And so fate once attempted drowning found way breathing again because water takes much. Yet it never takes what God decides keeping. River returned son to mother, returned shame to ones who planted it, and returned balance to land lacking it far too long. In end, as always, justice arrived. Not through human hands, but through silent flow of life nobody can stop. If this video touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to channel. Share with someone you care about. It helps us keep telling stories like this. And let me know in comments where watching from. I'd love knowing.